Before first light on February 27, 1776, Lieutenant Colonel Donald McLeod stood at the edge of a black creek in the North Carolina backcountry and saw exactly what he wanted to see. An empty camp. The rebel militia that had been shadowing his column for days had seemingly melted into the dark, abandoning their earthworks and leaving their cook fires still smoking on the far bank. Behind McLeod waited a Loyalist army, by most accounts somewhere near 1,600 men, and at its core marched Highland Scots, the most feared shock infantry the King's cause could put in the field anywhere in the colony. In front of them lay a single narrow bridge over Moores Creek. The plan was almost insultingly simple. Cross the bridge, brush aside whatever cowards remained, and finish the march to the coast, where a British fleet and a British army were already gathering to hand the entire South back to the Crown. It should have taken a morning. The fighting itself took about 3 minutes, and almost none of those minutes belonged to the men who crossed first. So, how did a scratch force of farmers, shopkeepers, and backcountry riflemen, no standing army, no navy, no reputation to speak of, break a Highland broadsword charge in a single winter dawn, and in doing so, quietly smother Britain's grand plan for the southern colonies before it ever truly began? The answer was not numbers. The Loyalists had the numbers. The answer was a bridge, a few barrels of grease, and a decision that looked, on paper, exactly like running away. To understand why that morning mattered so much, you have to understand how badly the rebellion was going everywhere else. The winter of 1775 into 1776 was not a season of momentum for the American cause. Far to the north, a desperate assault on Quebec had ended in catastrophe on the last night of December. General Richard Montgomery dead in the snow, Benedict Arnold shot through the leg, an American army shattered against a walled city it could not take. On New Year's Day, the port of Norfolk, Virginia, had gone up in flames. To London, and to the royal governors watching the coastline, the picture was clear. The rebellion was overextended, underarmed, and ripe to be split apart from the south upward. North Carolina's exiled royal governor, Josiah Martin, had promised exactly that. Rally the king's loyal subjects in the interior, march them to the sea, link them to British regulars, and roll the rebellion up one colony at a time. Moores Creek was where that promise was supposed to come true. The men marching to keep it were not villains, and it is a mistake to picture them that way. Many were Highland Scots, recent immigrants who had crossed an ocean to escape the wreckage of a lost cause of their own, and who had sworn personal oaths of loyalty to King George as the price of their new land. Among them rode figures out of legend. Flora MacDonald, the woman who had once smuggled Bonnie Prince Charlie past British troops after the slaughter at Culloden, was now on the Loyalist side of this war, reportedly rallying the Highlanders in Gaelic to march for the very crown that had hunted her 30 years earlier. Their commanding general, Donald MacDonald, was an aging veteran soldier who understood the terrible arithmetic of a charge, but he had fallen ill on the march, leaving the assault in the hands of subordinates hungry to prove it. These were disciplined, brave, loyal men. That was precisely the problem, and precisely what the man waiting on the far bank intended to use against them. That man was Colonel Richard Caswell, and he was in every way the opposite of a career general. He had arrived in North Carolina as a young man from Maryland with almost nothing, and he had made himself. He learned the land first as a deputy surveyor, walking and mapping the same backcountry he would one day defend, then studied law, won a seat in the colonial assembly, and earned a reputation as a man of sharp, practical judgment. He had even led militia in the field before, years earlier, at the Battle of Alamance, commanding men against the very kind of backcountry fighters some of these Loyalists had once been. Caswell was no aristocrat and no professional soldier. He was a self-taught frontier lawyer who paid attention, and he had grasped something his opponents had not. He knew the Highlanders would come straight at him, fast and screaming, because coming straight at the enemy was the thing that had made them famous. And he had found a piece of ground that would turn that courage into a trap. At first, Caswell did the conventional thing, and it nearly cost him everything. He marched his men to the west bank of Moores Creek, the same side the Loyalists were approaching from, and began throwing up earthworks there, planting his force squarely in the enemy's path. It was the textbook move. Meet them, block the road, hold the line. But sometime in the dark hours before the battle, Caswell looked hard at his own position and saw the truth of it. His back was to a creek, His only line of retreat was a single bridge. If the Highland charge hit his works and broke them, and Highland charges had a long, bloody history of breaking exactly this kind of line, his entire army would be pinned against black water with nowhere to run. He had built himself a trap. So he did the thing that looked to any Loyalist scout watching from the tree line like pure panic. He abandoned the works and pulled his whole force back across the bridge in the night. To the men marching toward him, it read as a rout. The rebels had lost their nerve and fled at the last moment, and Caswell wanted it to read exactly that way. He left the cook fires burning on the empty west bank, a stage set of an army that had run. What he had actually done was pick better ground and invite the enemy to walk into it. Now pay close attention to what he did to the bridge itself, because this is the hinge the entire morning turned on. Moore's Creek was crossed by a simple structure, a plank roadway laid over two long log stringers. Caswell's men tore up the planks and carried them away, leaving only the two bare logs spanning the creek like a pair of narrow, rounded rails. Then they smeared those logs with soap and tallow until they were slick as ice. A charging man in heavy gear could no longer run across the bridge. He could barely balance on it. To cross at all, the Highlanders would have to inch out over open water, single file, exposed, their broadswords useless against a creek, and step straight into a killing ground the Patriots had spent the night preparing. That ground was the real weapon. On the east bank, roughly 1,000 Patriot militia under Caswell and Colonel Alexander Lillington had dug in behind fresh earthworks, arranged in a crescent so their fire would converge on the far end of the bridge. And they were not relying on muskets alone. Sunk into the works sat two small artillery pieces the men had nicknamed, with backwoods affection, Old Mother Covington and her daughter. Every element pointed at the same 6 feet of greased log. The riflemen's lanes, the muskets, the cannon, all of it was laid to converge on the one spot the Highlanders would be forced to funnel through, one exposed man at a time. Think about what Caswell had actually engineered here. He had taken the single greatest strength of his enemy, the shock and speed of a massed broadsword charge, a tactic that had terrified professional British regulars a generation earlier, and he had built a place where that strength could not exist. There would be no massed charge. There would be no shock. There would be a narrow, slippery bottleneck, a converging wall of lead, and men brave enough to keep coming anyway. The trap was set before the Loyalists ever saw the creek in daylight. All that remained was for someone on the other side to spring it. On the Loyalist side of the creek, the decision to attack was not made by the man best qualified to make it. General Donald MacDonald, the old campaigner who best understood what a charge could and could not do, lay ill in his tent, unable to lead. Command of the assault fell instead to his eager subordinates, chief among them Lieutenant Colonel Donald McLeod, men who had marched a loyal army across the colony and were hungry to justify every mile of it. When their scouts crept forward in the dark and found the rebel earthworks on the west bank abandoned, the fires still burning, they read it the way Caswell had prayed they would. The enemy had lost its nerve. The rebels were running. All that stood between the king's men and the coast was a bridge and a few stragglers too slow to flee. That was the warning they never heard. The burning fires were not a sign of panic, but the bait of a snare, and no one in the Loyalist camp let themselves consider it. To understand why they charged anyway, you have to understand the strange, tragic loyalty that had brought these men to this creek. Most of the Highlanders had crossed an ocean in the wreckage of a lost war of their own. A generation earlier, their clans had risen against the crown and been butchered for it at Culloden, and the survivors had been made to swear personal oaths of allegiance to King George as the price of keeping their lives and their land. Now those oaths had come due. Somewhere back along the column rode Alan MacDonald, husband of Flora, the woman who had once saved a fugitive prince from British soldiers, marching to honor a promise to the very king who had once hunted his family. These were not mercenaries, they were men keeping their word, and it would cost most of them everything. There was a deeper reason still that they trusted the charge waiting in their legs. The massed broadsword rush was the most famous weapon their people owned. Screaming clansmen with broadswords had once broken professional British regulars at Preston, Pans and Falkirk, sent trained infantry running in terror. It was in their blood and their memory as the thing that worked. What too many of them chose not to remember in the cold hour before dawn was how it had ended at Culloden. That same charge marched straight into disciplined musket and cannon fire and torn apart. Some of these very men had stood on that field and lived. Now, 30 years later and an ocean away, they were about to run the experiment again. Before sunrise, the vanguard formed up, a body of picked swordsmen at the front, McLeod among them. The war cry went up in the dark, King George and broadswords, and they came. Picture it from McLeod's eyes as he reaches the bridge. The planks are gone. Where a roadway should be, there are only 2 bare logs, and they are wet, impossibly slick underfoot. His men are already crowding behind him, the momentum of the charge shoving them forward onto a crossing built for one careful man at a time. There is no line to hold, no wall of swords to hit the enemy all at once. There is only him and a handful of others, balanced over black water, broadswords raised at an enemy they cannot yet see clearly in the gloom. And then the far bank comes alive. The Patriots had held their fire. Now, at point-blank range, the crescent of earthworks erupted, a converging sheet of musket fire, and both cannon, old Mother Covington and her daughter, firing straight down the length of the bridge. The men on the greased logs had nowhere to go. They could not charge forward fast, could not spread out, could not retreat through the press of their own comrades behind them. McLeod drove himself across anyway. By the accounts that survive, he made it, reaching the rebel side of the creek before he fell, cut down almost on top of the enemy works, struck more times than anyone afterward cared to count. Captain John Campbell dropped beside him. The 2 officers who had insisted on the charge died at the very front of it, on the wrong side of a bridge they were never meant to reach. Behind them, the rest of the Loyalist army got a clear look at what a broadsword charge was worth against prepared firepower and a slick bridge. And the fight went out of them all at once. There was no rally. There was no second wave. The king's men turned and ran, abandoning weapons, wagons, and the whole promise of a Loyalist South on the frozen ground behind them. From the first shot to the last, the fighting lasted only a few minutes. When it was over and the smoke cleared off the creek, the tally was almost impossible to believe. On the Loyalist side, roughly 30 men lay dead or wounded, including both of the officers who had led the charge. On the Patriot side, in a battle that decided the fate of an entire colony, the losses were these: 1 man killed, 1 man wounded. That is not a typo, and it is not an exaggeration polished smooth by 2 centuries of retelling. It is the kind of casualty ratio that makes a historian stop, set down the source, and go looking for a second one to confirm it, because a lopsided result like that is exactly what usually turns out to be a legend rather than a fact. Here, the records hold. A charge that had once terrified the professional armies of Europe had been broken by backcountry farmers in about the time it takes to read this paragraph, at the cost of a single Patriot life. So, think about what Richard Caswell actually did on that creek. Because it was not the thing the songs usually celebrate. He did not beat the Highlanders by being braver than they were. He built a place where their bravery had nowhere to land. He did not stop a broadsword charge with a bigger charge of his own. He stopped it with a bridge stripped to 2 bare logs and a barrel of grease. He did not outfight the finest shock infantry the king could raise in the colony. He outthought them. He studied the one thing they trusted most, the headlong rush that had made their people famous, and he engineered a morning in which that exact strength became the reason they died. The genius of Moore's Creek was never firepower. It was a man who understood his enemy well enough to turn their courage into a trap, and the consequences ran far past that single bridge. In the days after the battle, Patriot forces swept up the fleeing and the scattered. By most accounts, around 850 Loyalists taken prisoner, along with their wagons, their weapons, and a war chest of gold coin meant to fund the king's southern rising. The rising itself simply ceased to exist. When the British fleet and army that Governor Martin had promised finally arrived off the North Carolina coast that spring, they found no loyal Highland army waiting to join them. That army was dead, captured, or hiding. The whole plan to roll the rebellion up from the south had lost its foundation before the first British regular stepped ashore. The invasion force turned instead toward Charleston, where in June of 1776 it was beaten back again at Sullivan's Island. The South would be spared a major British campaign for years to come. Pay attention to the timing, because it is easy to miss how much this backward skirmish shaped. Just weeks after Moore's Creek, in April of 1776, North Carolina became the first colony to formally authorize its delegates to vote for independence. The Halifax Resolves, a direct answer to a colony that had just proven it could defend itself. A creek most of the country has never heard of helped clear the path to a vote in Philadelphia that summer that everyone has. The war would grind on for years, all the way to a British surrender at Yorktown that the audience already knows is coming. But the southern strategy that Britain was counting on to win it had been broken on a February morning at a bridge with its planks pulled up. As for the Highlanders who survived, the war was not finished with them. General Donald MacDonald and Alan MacDonald, Flora's husband, were among the captured, marched off to imprisonment far from the homes they had crossed an ocean to build. Flora herself endured the years that followed in hardship, her family's property plundered, before the MacDonalds finally gave up on America altogether and sailed back to the same Scotland they had once fled. The woman who had once saved a prince and the men who had charged a bridge for their king ended the war much as they had begun it, exiles keeping faith with a losing cause. Today, Moores Creek runs quiet through a national battlefield in eastern North Carolina, and you can walk the ground where all of this happened in an afternoon. The earthworks have long since softened into low green rises. There are monuments now to the Patriots who dug in on the far bank and to the Highlanders who charged and fell, honored rather than mocked, because both sides that morning were made of men who believed they were doing right. There is a stone for John Grady, remembered as the one patriot who did not walk home. The bridge is gone, the creek is still there, still narrow, still crossing that same stretch of low country, a small piece of water that decided which way an entire region of the Revolution would tip. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the overlooked battles where cleverness beat force and one good decision outweighed 1,000 swords, subscribe, because there are dozens more of these stories coming. If the story earned it, drop a like so more people find their way to this creek. And tell me in the comments, was it Caswell's decision to pull his men back across that bridge, the move that looked like surrender, that really won this battle? Or was it the moment those planks came up? I read every answer.